Patrick James.
Edward Haynes.
How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, thank you. Yeah. Do you ever listen to Savan's podcast?
Not his individual one. I used to listen to the Savan Matt Josh one.
Yeah. I don't know if
I really like him as a person, actually.
Yeah, me too. I do just love he's so authentic and just is always Savan, which is really cool. But what I was thinking of is how we started this just now is so Savan never does an intro to his podcasts. He just basically you hit play and he's just in a conversation about something or he's asking a question. I always think it's quite cool. You never know really what part of the conversation you're in. You just got to catch up and get into it.
That's true. Like that, it would be Josh and Savan on a call, and Matt would come in like 15 minutes later, and they'd be like, "Oh, here he is."
Yeah. And you know what? Another thing I quite liked was he does these live podcasts now where he's actually doing it live on YouTube with the person, and sometimes that person will just cut out, and so the person won't be there. And essentially, the person he's interviewing is no longer there, so he just starts talking to himself. And he just starts going off on these unbelievable tangents. It's like he's obviously a very, very smart guy, but they're actually hilarious. He just goes and that was something I really like, because I'm like, he just doesn't put pressure on himself to have to create each episode to be a certain standard, or maybe that is just the standard we all expect when we listen to Savan's podcast versus there are some podcasts which is just so finely tuned, and you know exactly what you're going to get every single time. There's barely a second between words. They've just been cut down to the absolute second. Anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, but I
think the one thing with Savan that I dislike about him is that whole sugar is worse than heroin kind of mentality, which I think is just so 2020. It's even like before that, but really, for the general population, they just need to have an understanding of eating sugar is okay, but just in moderation. Whereas he's like, all sugar is bad. Everyone should be paleo, basically.
He started his whole war on sugar in an episode with Hunter McIntyre, who's a very outspoken guy, and Hunter just came back with, well, like, sugar's not bad. I eat sugar all the time, but I'm an athlete and sugar serves a purpose. And Savannah actually was in agreement. So I think with context, he gets it. But I do agree. He does have a very strong stance in that. But again, I think that's cool. I think that's cool that he has a stance and he's not afraid to say it, even if it might offend people. And actually, that's what I like about him, is that half the shit he does say actually does really offend the people that's on his podcast, but he just says it anyway.
Yeah. Ballsy.
Anyway, so let's get back to the agenda. The agenda,
as you can see, I'm in my library right now, back in the UK.
For anyone watching right now, Paddy's been transported back in time to the late 1800s. And that goes for his clothing as well as the backdrop. I think, Paddy, what do you have? You have something about to be removed from a wall in your house?
Oh, I have a radiator. A plumber is taking off a radiator. So
no, so we might hear just shit being torn off the walls in a few minutes. I've got someone drilling a few floors above me right now, so it sounds like they've stopped temporarily, but that may come back on. Anyway, fingers crossed. Neither of those two things happen.
How are you?
I'm well, thanks, Patrick.
What's
Not
new?
Too bad. What's new? What is new? That's quite a funny question, isn't it? What's new? Because obviously,
what's new with you?
Yeah, what's new with you? Well, I'll just say what I've been doing today. How about that?
Yeah, that sounds fine with me.
It has been a very busy day. It's been many things stacked back to back. So it began with the morning with some programming, and then our schedules have all been shifted forward an hour relative to what you're used to because of the new training and coaching schedule. So we start training at 9:30. So got in, trained, and then essentially had a very quick, then we had a team meeting, because we are obviously running group sessions outside at the moment in small little pods of 3. And so we're having to meet as a team each week to make some adjustments to the Live, Perform, Compete program to make it work for the little equipment that we have outside, and to make sure that we're just we're not overly complicating it. We're not, completely taking up all the space in that park, and we're trying to make it as simple as possible. So we had a meeting there. And then I had 3 hours on the trot with clients outside, and then jumped in a Uber to get here to record a podcast with you. What's been going on with you?
Well, it's I've only been up for an hour, and that's that. I haven't even had any coffee yet. Just high on life.
Where are you in the world, Patrick? Because obviously you haven't been on for a few episodes.
True. Sad. But I've been listening. I've enjoyed the episodes that have been coming out. I'm currently in Warminster in Wiltshire in the UK. I'm Paddy and I'm from England.
And I play rugby.
So I'm currently residing in my mum's house, spending some time with her. Kiara, my girlfriend, has just come down from Loughborough and is spending some time here as well. So that'll be nice. Nothing too strenuous, just enjoying the UK, getting outside in this green and pleasant land. It was -2 degrees yesterday.
Have you had any snow?
No, well, I have had snow, but it didn't settle, unfortunately. Where we are is basically sea level, so it'd have to be like a horrendous amount of snow and the right conditions for it to settle.
Yeah.
So, not like Newcastle.
Not like Newcastle, mate. That was a northern accent. That wasn't a Geordie accent. Oh, actually, shame on us.
Never mind.
We did an episode, Paddy, where we meticulously laid out what your training plan was going to look like when you got back to the UK. How's that been going?
It's not been going well, Ed. At the start of the year, anyway, at the start of my holiday. But as you know, I am a relatively stubborn person and don't tend to listen to my body. And I actually can't remember prior to this holiday the last time I took more than 3 days off of training in the last year and a half, 2 years. And that includes when I've broken my wrist. So like even the day after I came out of hospital, I was on the bike doing stuff. So I didn't have any time off for ages. So, and having, spending time with Kiara, and when we first met up, when I got back into the UK, we just didn't have any motivation to do it. We did one session the second day that we were here, and then we just didn't really want to. We had we were going all over the country and had plans and stuff. I just didn't really have any motivation to do it, and I wasn't really thinking to myself, oh, this is awful. I was like, well, if the motivation isn't there or the drive isn't there, I'd rather spend my time doing something else than I'll spend my time doing something else. Like, I'm not going to force myself into the gym during the holiday if I don't want to do it. But the difference is that when I'm in a routine, I don't need any motivation to go to the gym. It's not like I just do it. But I didn't want to do it. I was actively thinking to myself, I don't want to go to the gym. So that was telling me everything about it. So I just didn't. And then I did another session, maybe a week and a half later, just like some full body resistance. And then since the new year started, I've been doing sort of 2 to 3, sometimes 4 full body resistance sessions. And I've done a couple of runs here and there. And I did my first proper like monostructural cardio session on Monday of this week. And it felt great. Really nice. And I love that stuff, as you know, like I love sitting on the rower, on the bike, on the skier, just for like 20, 30, 40 minutes, doing 12 cows on and off, that kind of stuff. So that was really nice. Got back into my routines again of meditating and journaling and eating, not drinking alcohol socially. Casually. So when it gets to Christmas mode, it's kind of like, a couple of glasses of wine with dinner, couple of gin and tonics, and that just you kind of fall into that habit of it just being, you're just constantly drinking basically over the course of the holidays. And last week I was basically like, all right, that'll do. Like I'm done having a couple of beers with dinner, because I enjoy it, but I don't need it. And when I'm in my normal routine working, I don't drink casually at all. Like I don't have a glass of wine or a beer with dinner. It would just be, I'm going out for drinks or I'm going on a night out or something like that. That's when I'll drink. So So got back into the routines now. I have still been able to experiment, like I talked about in the episode before, with some new equipment. The gym that's local to me here is got a hack squat, which I'm going to use.
Nice.
Which is cool. Just watched an N1 video last night on hack squatting, actually, which was cool. So I'm going to take some of those points in. And yeah, just in general, get back into a bit more of a routine, eating a little bit better, focusing on better nutrition, not drinking so much, sleeping a bit better, all my other routines, and I feel good.
Nice.
So yeah, that's me.
Thank you for the update. Did you very quickly, at any point, did you feel any guilt for not training? Because I know that's something that you struggle with in Hong Kong. You know, there's been times where you've clearly known that you shouldn't be training, that your body doesn't want to be training, but you've forced yourself through it because you just don't want to have to deal with not doing it and how that might make you feel. So yeah, how's it felt taking a few rest days, and how have you dealt with it? And is there anything, I don't know, any takeaways that you're gonna try and bring back into life over here when you get back?
Yeah, like keep for me to keep looking at the bigger picture, and that really, like, so over the course of Christmas, I have put on 1 kilo. Now, for some people that might seem like a lot. That is nothing. Like, one for me, considering that last Christmas, over the course of Christmas plus November, I'd put on 20 kilos, which is enormous. To put on 1 kilo, and like that, what it says about my relationship with food and with eating now is so much better. Like, for example, if I was making myself something for lunch, I would make 2 bagels and something else just to because I could. So it was like, oh, you've given yourself the floodgates have opened, so then go for it. When actually what I did this Christmas was a lot more controlled. So it was like, well, I'm going to have this nice thing for lunch, but I'm just going to have 1. And then, because I don't need to have 2 bagels plus a packet of crisps and a chocolate bar, I could just have the 1 bagel, which has got some calorie dense stuff in it. And that's that. That'll tie me over. I'll have a bit of fruit in the afternoon, and I'll have a big dinner and some wine. And I went through that approach all the way through Christmas. I had some crap, drunk a lot, whatever. But the fact that I only put on 1 kilo is, for me, is awesome. Bearing in mind, I haven't done much training, but also I won't have lost any muscle in 2 weeks. Like, I might have lost a little bit of muscle glycogen, which might make me look a little bit less full. And then I might be a little bit more inflamed from some of the more sugary foods and some of the alcohol and things like that. But I know that that'll fall off me in a couple of weeks. So really, it just shows me that, having 2, 3, 4 days does nothing to how my body feels, really, or my performance for what I want to do. I think that mindset is spilled over from CrossFit, where, if you miss a day, it's like, oh, well, Rich Froning did this in this day. So think about all those other people that you're competing against that have done those additional sessions when you took those 4 days off. But even then, take someone like Matt Fraser. He was having weeks and weeks off after the games. And obviously, granted, absolute freak, prerequisite of unbelievable technique in weightlifting, etc. But still, there were people around him that were on a par with his technique or his physical attributes, but he took the time off. He structured his training in a much more intelligent way, listened to his body a lot more, and it resulted in so much more for him. So I think the biggest takeaway for me is that having time off is definitely a good thing, both mentally and physically. But the worst case scenario of what you think has happened isn't actually happening. You know what I mean? You think you're going to just erode all muscle that you've built over the last 5 years is just going to completely go. But one, it actually comes back quickly, which we know through scientific research, and also it doesn't go that fast.
I think also, just by giving your body the break and the rest it needs, you're actually creating the ability to build more muscle and progress more strength long term by having those periodic breaks. So it's actually, when you take a more a more macro view of it all, it's an essential part to long-term growth of muscle tissue and sports performance, or whatever performance means to you. But I do think, I think something that myself and yourself are fortunate about is that we've built so much consistency for a really, really long time that that gives us the flexibility to have more time off and not have any negative effects. I think it'd be different for someone who's probably just starting out on their health and fitness journey. They're a month in, they probably can't afford to take a month off and not see any negative changes because they just haven't built the consistency and essentially built the foundations and the base enough. But I completely agree. It's funny so over Christmas I stopped weighing and measuring for probably, I took 2 weeks off roughly off work. And in that 2 weeks, I didn't weigh and measure really any of my meals. I would probably weigh and measure breakfast because I'm just such in a routine there. But lunch and dinner, I was cooking a lot more, eating out a lot more. So when I eat intuitively, which is, I'm definitely eyeballing my meals, trying to roughly get what I would normally eat. But then a lot of it is just listening to my body and my hunger signals, really. I came out of that actually a kilo lighter. And I always find when I go back to intuitive eating, I get lighter. And, you've actually, intuitive eating has probably put on a kilogram for you, because I was also, drinking and having a lot more alcohol than I normally would. That's always the way I tend to go. I always come out of an intuitive phase a little bit lighter than I would normally.
I am a fatty. Like I am meant to be obese. My psychology is I'm meant to be morbidly obese. Like if I could, and if it was socially acceptable and I had the food in the house to do it, I'd probably eat every 2 hours, like a meal of just crap. I can just stomach it.
You can. And I've witnessed it many a time.
Yeah, you have. Be like, but it's 11 o'clock. You're having 2 Snickers bars. Yeah. All right.
I feel like Skulk, one of our newest coaches, is going to start to rival you there, though. Today he had his lunch and he just brought an extra box of 2 donuts and was just eating donuts out in the sun. It was good. It was enjoyable to watch. He has an extremely fast metabolism.
Yeah, that's the difference there, is that like I then have to like work it off with loads of cardio or whatever, or then have bouts of being more restrictive, whereas Skulk could like chug olive oil and he'd still be the same.
Yeah, true. Anyway, Paddy, thanks for the update. I'm looking forward to seeing how you bring those lessons from giving yourself a bit of time off back into the gym when you get back, whenever that's going to be. But let's get back to our agenda today. We are on episode 101.
101, room 101.
And what we thought we'd do today is to do a bit of reflecting on 100 episodes. This doesn't count. So to reflect back on 100 episodes and to pull out some of the lessons that we've taken out of it as being podcast hosts, doing the podcast together, but maybe even some things that we've taken out of some of the interviews that we've done and things other people have said. And basically to have, just a bit of a back and forth. So Paddy, you're going to start first, whatever your first thing is. And then I'm going to piggyback on that. And we're just going to go back and forth. What are our biggest lessons from 100 episodes of the Process podcast? Starting with you.
I'm going to go with active listening to start off with. So
nice one.
I think what do you remember what episode it was that we did the meditation, the mindfulness one? Was it like 70, 80 something?
Keep on talking. As you're talking, I will find it.
Anyway, I think it was something that you said to me after that episode, and it was like after we finished recording, and it was like just be, it's very difficult to stay focused for the whole conversation, and because you said at times even I was doing this where I was dipping in and out of what you were telling me, and it's so easy for us, whether this is talking about a podcast or whether this is having a conversation with someone else, to not actively listen. And it's actually a trait that I dislike in people now, which maybe that's me standing on a pedestal, but it's a trait I dislike in someone when they are just waiting for you to finish your sentence so they can then say what they want to say, rather than it being whatever is being said is absorbed first and then processed, which I'll agree is something that I still need to get better at, especially when I'm just having a conversation. But when I go into podcast mode, and it links in with another point that we've got, but just being able to listen, not have like anything predetermined, but to just listen to what someone is saying to you in a conversation and then responding to that, rather than I was actually listening to a podcast. So Kiara was listening to a revision podcast on her before her nutrition exam, and we were listening to it together. And this guy had someone who was well known in scientific literature for muscle protein synthesis. I can't remember his name. Like obviously very intelligent guy. The other guy who was podcasting, no offense if he's listening to this, unlikely, did a terrible job of actively listening. He basically just, the guy finished and then he just went, cool, nice, next question. Like there was no follow-up question. There was no question in response to what he'd said. It was, he had 10 questions. It was like he was doing a Q&A, but just answered, and that was it. There was no back and forth at all. So you may as well have just like sent the questions over, got the guest to read out the questions, and then answer them himself. Like there was no conversation. So for me, now that I can listen to podcasts like that, and you're like, well, that's not a conversation going on there. And I think I certainly anyway listen to podcasts now that aren't really that informative and are much more kind of conversational between friends or colleagues or things like that. You know, like when Joe Rogan has his friends on, that's a podcast I'll listen to versus one of him talking about coronavirus propaganda. Or whatever. So that's my point.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I love that. I think firstly, I've been on podcasts as a guest where it's been clear that the person interviewing me hasn't been actively listening. And it's something that, you know, we all experience in everyday life in having conversations with people. And it kind of makes you feel uncomfortable when you can see someone's already checked out. Maybe it's eye contact, they're kind of looking elsewhere. It's body language, they kind of start looking, you know, shoulders slumped forward, they start to look down, and you just kind of get the feeling like, oh, what I'm saying here actually isn't very important. And definitely as a person speaking it, I tend to retract straight away and stop probably being as open and honest as I probably would have been had they been listening. And that in itself prevents a conversation from flowing and a connection and a relationship from forming. I do think, you know, thinking back to applying this back to podcast, when I first started interviewing people on the podcast, and I was, you know, I hadn't had any practice actually, you know, doing a live interview, I definitely felt the pressure of what the audience would think. And something I was really scared of was like silence. And so what I found myself doing, it was pulling me out of the present moment and just listening to, you know, this amazing guest sharing what they had to say. And I was already thinking about what an audience might be thinking about that person and what they're saying, and then preempting the next question ahead of time because I didn't want that awkward silence, which might mean that someone wouldn't enjoy the episode, which is ridiculous because, you know, I was then preventing the conversation from flowing. And, you know, if it was an educational based, you know, interviewing conversation, that then stopped really good information potentially coming out of the guest. And, you know, it's active listening is something I practice now all the time. Like every day I get the opportunity to practice it with the clients that I work with the team. You know, I actually just finished a session with one of my clients who I've been working with for a really long time. And, you know, she wanted to actually just share something really personal with me and asked if it was okay if she shared it with me because she wanted to get my opinion on it. So we're 30 minutes into a session here. And I said, you know, absolutely, you know, I'd love to hear it if you'd be open to sharing it. And we actually ended up talking for the next 30 minutes. We didn't train. This is the first time in the 8+ years I've trained this person. That's probably the least amount of training we've ever done in a session. And of that talking, I probably spoke for about 2 minutes. And, you know, she came to me with advice. And I think, you know, previously going back to how I would have responded to that was, okay, this person's asking me for advice. I better have some advice to give them. That I would put the pressure on myself to do that. Whereas, you know, in actual fact, like we so often talk about, when people ask for advice, they often know the answers already. We just need to help guide them with questions to help that answer, you know, come to the surface and essentially they make that decision themselves. So yeah, I love that one, Patrick.
Yeah, it's so powerful though. That's a lot of stuff that we've been doing on book club is about just listening. Like a lot of the time, if someone wants to speak to you, they actually just want an ear. And so often that is the case. You just need to kind of maybe guide them towards something within the conversation that allows them to feel safe, or hits home at you can identify something that they're not fully opening up to, or have you thought about this? Like one small question on top of what they've been regurgitating, and then that's them off for another 10-15 minutes. Yeah. And it's I compare it to journaling really, because it's like there's no judgment, there's no wall up or barrier up, or hopefully there's no barrier up, and you can just say right freely what you feel about a situation. And active listening, whether you've been asked for advice or whether it's just a conversation, does the same thing, where it just gives you a platform to be able to like say what you want to say.
Yeah. And sometimes just showing that person that when they talk to you, them talking is the only thing that matters to you right now. And that's with like things like eye contact, making sure your phone is away, there is no distractions around you. Just by simply doing that and listening can make someone really feel safe, like you said. And again, like they kind of, sometimes how often does it happen where they start talking and they just keep on rolling, and 30 minutes later they're still talking, and they've come to the conclusion already and just have thanked you so much for your time and advice, and you've actually been like, I didn't actually need to say anything. I
said nothing.
Yeah, you found it all yourself. Okay, awesome. Well, good first one, active listening. That's going to bring me on to my one, which is the importance of being present. So I guess being present and active listening are two very, very similar concepts. But when it comes to the podcast, I know that the best episodes that we've ever done have been where there is zero distraction. I'm where my feet are. I'm not thinking about what's happened previous in the day. I'm not thinking about what's about to come up in a day. It is just me, you, or me and the guest, or you and the guest, and it's this podcast right now. And being present is something that's been something I think about in life a lot. Multiple times throughout the day, I'm always thinking about the concept of presence and creating the awareness of when I'm not present. Just as an example, I think there's two examples that spring to mind when I think about this podcast. There was one day, and we talked about it on the podcast, where you had set up the room already. I'd just come out of, I think, a few hours of something busy, and I, ran into the recording studio, aka the physio room, and you were ready to hit record. And I said, Paddy, I think I just need 5 minutes, because I knew I was carrying a lot of busyness from what I'd just been doing. And I knew that if I went straight into the conversation, I wouldn't have clarity and I wouldn't have focus on what we were about to do. So we both stuck on a headspace and we meditated. We think we did a 5 or 10 minute meditation together.
5 minutes. Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah. And it just that having that separation between busyness was all that was needed to then bring focus into what we were about to do, which was record a great podcast episode. And, just before I jumped on this call here, I knew that it's been a really busy day. I didn't have the time to do my normal 20 minutes of decompression post-workout. It was just straight into another meeting, then into another meeting, then into clients, and rushing home to get onto the podcast. And I knew that if I didn't create a quick bit of separation before we jumped on this call, it would seriously hamper our ability to record a really good episode, which basically means that we're going to have a good conversation. So I actually asked you for 10 minutes extra, and I got out my Shakti mat, popped my legs up on my beanbag, and lay right behind me just for 10 minutes and just closed my eyes and just did deep breathing. Didn't even do a headspace. It just wanted to, I would say silence, but I was just listening to drilling upstairs for 10 minutes. But doing that and just, creating the separation and just, being attentive to what was going on in my mind and creating the ability to bring me back down into a more relaxed state. I got up from that 10 minutes and was like, ready. But truth be told, in that Uber ride coming home, and I was thinking about what our conversation was going to be, because, we'd already pre-planned what the subject was going to be today. I tried to think about what the things I wanted to talk about were, and I had nothing. Zero. I literally just couldn't even find a starting place to start to think about what I wanted to speak about. And there's been times in the past where I would have sat there and forced something. I would have just sat and I would have got frustrated, and then I probably would have come out with some shit that I wasn't proud of and recorded anyway. Instead, I knew that that was the case, gave myself 10 minutes to breathe, and then suddenly all the clarity was there. And I'm loving this conversation already. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think when we've both been fully locked in, I actually think I'd say probably the best conversations have been when it's just been you and me, and it's quite an intimate space, the physio room where we do it, because it's a narrow table. It's probably like maybe a foot wide, and we're sat in front of each other. Obviously there's a microphone there, but we're basically eye contact to eye contact for
those is touching.
Yeah, basically for a full hour and however long. And you sounds weird, like get lost in your eyes. It's like you just get lost in the conversation of like there's nothing else going around. You're just fully present with that, and it's not like when we're having a conversation, it's not like one of us is trying to better someone else or like get in with what we want to say. It's very much we enjoy hearing what the other person has to say about it. So then the focus is even more so on what they're saying, rather than if it was someone that you disagreed with, for example, and you were trying to get your point in on a conversation, it would be much more just waiting for them to finish rather than actually listening to what they've got to say. But if you actually value what someone has to say and then you respond from it, definitely being more present in those moments adds to the conversation for sure. So yeah, I completely agree with that. I think just going off the mindfulness stuff, it's, we've talked about it a lot on the podcast, and I think just from regurgitating it so much, it does seem to me like it's just so worthwhile. And when it's in my routine, the amount of people that we've had on, whether it's been Ant, whether it's been Tammy, Liam, all these guests that we've had on from our coaches that have at some point picked up a meditation practice and have felt the benefits, and we've felt the benefits as well. And then being able to transfer that into a podcast or a conversational podcast, I think just, bangs home the point. If you haven't done it yet, try it.
Yeah, for sure. I think that leads nice.
We need Headspace to sponsor us, basically.
We do. You know what? I've actually thought about reaching out to Headspace many times. And even though I say that I've gotten over this fear of rejection, I definitely haven't with certain things. And like, I'm a part of me, and I know it's completely ridiculous. I should just reach out to them and see if they'd be interested in being a part of it, because we're such massive advocates and we talk about it all the time. Well, actually, you know what? As soon as we finish this podcast, I want to reach out to them. I want to message Andy.
Do it. And then next episode will be this episode is sponsored by Headspace. Well, it's not, but we've decided anyway.
Okay, I think that leads us nicely into your next point, Paddy. Do you remember what it was? I've got it written down here.
There's no right answer.
Yes.
Yeah. I think from this, the amount of, I wouldn't say the amount of personal growth, but the personal growth that I have done this year, a lot of it has been around kind of taking my opinion and my views off of a pedestal and not assuming that my opinion is right, because this is something that I've talked about in book clubs and stuff, is that I am inherently confident in most aspects of my life, and with that comes kind of almost arrogance, and it can be perceived often as arrogance, especially when I'm meeting people for the first time, or I feel confident about a topic or about an opinion that I have. I'm very much one of those people that's tied to their views and kind of have the blinkers on. So that's something that I've tried to get better at, is to not take what I think as gospel and think that there are alternatives to it. And that is also I've then seen that with the podcast as well. For example, when we've had things like Coaches Roundtable, or we've had other coaches on and we're talking about, what do you think about this? Or what, how would you train this person? Or like, what do you think about this training methodology? And there are so many ways to go about getting someone to one goal, or there's so many ways to skin a cat, the general term, that there is no right answer in a lot of these cases. And it's just the case of, like you always said to me at the start, it was like, I'm not gonna knock you for any programming that you're doing. I just want you to be able to justify why you're doing each thing, and if you can make a valid justification for why you're doing something, then that's enough. And that just like brought home the point that there is no right answer with so many aspects, whether it's in training or nutrition or in life or whatever. Everyone has their own opinion, but also listen to other people's opinions, because that's what we've done on the podcast. And going off of the 100th episode that you had, which was what did you call it?
Overrated, underrated.
Overrated, underrated. And like everyone had a different perspective, a different view on something that you could argue is clear cut as good or not, or overrated or underrated. So for me, that's something that I've learned from the podcast, is to just, there's no right answer. There's many ways that people have.
Nice. When I think of there's no right answer, I think about Matthew McConaughey's book, where he is at lunch with someone in his autobiography, Green Light, and he says it's not about right or wrong, it's about do you understand? Do you remember that bit? That quote, he was having an argument with someone. The person had a different opinion to him. I think the other person, there were two people actually having an argument about something, and Matthew McConaughey tried to intervene. I believe this is right, and tell them to settle down. And they both looked at him and said, it's not about right or wrong, it's about do you understand? And that quote has literally stuck with me. That was probably the one quote from that entire book that has stuck with me forever, and I think about it all the time. And it makes me think about the 7 Habits for Highly Effective People, which was kind of one of the first self-help books I ever read. And there was a concept in there which is seek to understand to be understood, which is essentially, I think so much of the concept of right or wrong is believing that we have an opinion, we try to convince others that our opinion is right. And very much like you, I think I'm very much in the boat where I'm always really interested to hear when someone has a different opinion, but it's not to try. I think previously I would have gone at it in a sense where I would try to then convince that person that my opinion was right and that theirs was wrong. And now it's actually not about that. It's just, I want to understand, where that opinion comes from. And that's all that I want to do. If we have different opinions, we have different opinions, and that's great. But I love the process of digging to try to understand why someone has an opinion about anything. And I actually really enjoy that process.
Yeah. I feel like I need to reread the Matthew McConaughey again. But the only thing I would say is that I don't think he is that authentic.
Interesting. Well, let's not talk about authenticity, because that's going to be one of my things later.
Is it? I'm sorry.
We'll talk about Mr. McConaughey then. No, in fact, you know what, Patrick? Let's talk about authenticity now.
Okay, fine.
What are your thoughts on Mr. McConaughey and authenticity?
I just can't see it. Maybe this is maybe I'm clouded by my own judgment of this, but he has so many life lessons and so many quotes in there. I just don't think he lives his life as he says he does. I think there are times. Yeah, I don't know. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Like, I think like he almost comes across in that book like he's an absolute guru and he's got all these quotes and all these, like, I just don't think he adheres to all those quotes. I'm like, no one does all the time, that's for sure. But how he comes across, or how he is wanting to be perceived, I feel, in the book is that he's gone through all these life lessons, and this is who he is now, or these are my quotes that I live by. Well, I think some of it is a bit, I don't know.
I hear what you're saying 100%, but I actually get a very authentic vibe from Matthew McConaughey. Yeah. But I also think in the context of his book, he started journaling, like he started writing when he was really young.
That's true.
Right. And he didn't get to the stage of being able to put it into a book till he is now, I think he's in his 50s now. And so, firstly, I think he is a guy with a ton of life experience. Like he's been through a whole amount of different things. You know, even I think being an actor really exposes you to life lessons, because you're just having to basically live in so many different roles, different people all the time. I think it's an amazing way to learn about life and people anyway. I think that's a common theme that I've seen with a lot of like really good actors, and when I read about them or hear them in interviews. But I think, you know, he's got 50 years of language now, where he's been able to put those experiences, all those values in his life into really succinct words that were really powerful, which basically formed the chapter of his book, or I think it was called the road signs, whatever it was. Yeah, I don't know. Interesting. We'll never know. Bumper stickers, that's it. We'll never know until we actually meet him, eh?
Yeah, true.
So, anyway, I was going to go on authenticity was actually going to be my thing with the podcast.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to kind of the point that we were talking about when you first started talking about active listening, which was, I definitely felt when I first started the podcast, I was actually really nervous to get into podcasting. I knew it was something I wanted to do. I knew it was something I felt passionate about. And I knew there was a lot that I could share that I felt could speak to certain people. But I definitely did feel at the start a pressure to have to please everyone. And I remember after recording my first few episodes, one of my really good mates who's known me for a really long time, he messaged me and said, just listen to like your first 3 episodes of podcasts, thought they were really good, but I haven't heard the real Ed Haynes yet on the podcast. And I was like, interesting. What did he mean by that? Because I felt like I was being the real Ed Haynes. And I actually went back and listened to snippets of those episodes. And he was right. There was like, it was more like this corporate Ed Haynes that had, like, you know, run a business for 12 years, has been coaching for a long time. And I think that a big part of that was because the way that the podcast started was it was more of an educational based podcast. You know, I would essentially pick a theme or pick a topic. And this was before you joined. So it was, a lot of the time it was just myself, you know, trying to provide education to people. Where the podcast has evolved to, which I actually love, and I have to thank you for this because it was really your idea, which was like, it's just more of a conversation between a lot of the time myself and yourself, or the guests that we have. And, you know, there is always education and knowledge and wisdom that comes out of those conversations, but we don't have to necessarily put the pressure on ourselves to make it an educational podcast. Yeah. And what that allowed me to be was a lot more authentic. I think it was just, okay, well, this is just me, Ed Haynes, having a conversation with you, Patrick James, which we have all day, every day anyway at Coastal Fitness. So this is no different. And, you know, the moment I think we both started to be authentic and just share that authenticity with the world, you know, I think that's actually where we started to gain even more traction with the podcast. And so, yeah, authenticity, I think it's something we talked about a lot in other episodes, but that's my takeaway. What do you think?
Yeah, completely agree. I think it's polarizing in a positive way, because it's the same with you being authentic as a person in life, is that if you can be authentic and you're comfortable with who you are as your authentic self, that's one of the most important things. But then if you can be that, then it means that the people that disagree with who you are as a person, or don't like the podcast that you put out, whatever, then that's fine. That's, you're not supposed to be aligned with what we're doing, or who I am as a person, or where I am, or where you are at right now.
Yeah.
So it just, you know, it's like, this is the content that we want to put out in terms of a podcast. This is us just having a conversation, spreading some information, talking rubbish, whatever. And if you like it, great, keep tuning in. If you don't worry about it. Go and listen to someone else.
And I think that's one of the biggest things. Pleasing other people is one of the things that stops us as a race being authentic. We feel like we have to be someone else to, you know, whether if it's Instagram, it's getting the likes and getting the follows. If it's real life, it's popularity and getting invited to parties and, you know, be included in WhatsApp groups. Like, it's around us all the time. But, you know, I think very much where I'm at now in my life, and I think you are at a very similar stage in yours, is that, you know, we have now a bit more clarity on who we are and who we want to be. And just focusing on being that person is actually very liberating. And if, like you said, if people like it, they'll hang around and be a part of it. And if they don't, that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. And transferring that into work makes it so much easier to just, you don't have to pretend you're someone that you're not in work. And if you're working, 50 hours a week or whatever, and you're pretending to be someone that you're not, it's pretty hard.
It's tiring. Oh, I mean,
Very
I
tiring.
think back to, I really think back to like the end of secondary school. I think back to university. Like I had a lot of years there where I feel like I had no idea who I was and who I wanted to be. And even early days of coastal fitness, it is extremely tiring. Essentially you are acting every single day and asking yourself who you want to be in the next 10 minutes when you're around this group, and then who you're going to be tonight when you see the next group. And, playing up to that role is exhausting and it's stressful. And, to not have to do that anymore, or to not feel the pressure to ever have to do that anymore, is very nice.
Yeah, for sure. Completely agree.
Nice. Paddy, what's your next one? I have it written down here. Do you remember what it is? I think it flows nicely from what we just talked about. Vulnerability.
Vulnerability is the way forward.
Why?
Because it's you being authentic with your thoughts. It's you're not trying to be, or trying to pretend that you're doing better than you are, and vulnerability doesn't have to be a negative thing. It can be a positive thing, in something that you're vulnerable about. But just by being vulnerable to the people around you, or even like on the podcast, we've been very vulnerable and talked about experiences and things like that, and people naturally gravitate towards that. And I think that says everything about how powerful it is to be vulnerable, because the amount of times that we have put out episodes where we've talked about something very personal to us, and the people that have reached out to me privately about it, obviously shows that it resonates with people, because it's stuff that they're going through themselves, but maybe they haven't had the courage to be able to say it to their close ones, or to their family, or out loud to anyone else. So it brings people together, and that's something that we've learned being at Coastal, and it's something that we've done even more so on the podcast as well.
Yeah, I think like the power of connection that vulnerability brings is amazing. And I think, like you said, I think so much of the vulnerability that we share the vulnerability with one another on this podcast, because we joke about it, but it almost becomes almost a bit of therapy for ourselves, like being able to actually say the problems out loud that we're struggling with, and know that, for me, know that you're listening. It feels good. And like we talked about at the start, it allows us to then work through the problems. Sometimes I don't need you and I can work through it myself, but just by saying it out loud and verbalizing it is the first step to actually me making amends, to actually figure it out. And then sometimes that vulnerability, and having someone else's opinion is really helpful as well. But like you said, it can be a really scary thing being vulnerable on a public platform, like a podcast, or for most other people, their social media pages, or for some people, just being vulnerable with your team or your friends or your family and your colleagues. Because a lot of people, I think, have preset ideas. For example, I don't think what I have to say is going to benefit anyone else. Or I don't think what I have to say is actually anyone else's business, and therefore I shouldn't say it. Or I don't think anyone have any interest in what I want to say. Or I don't think what people are going to think about what I have to say is going to be positive, and therefore I'd rather not say it. But I think something that we experience all the time on this podcast is that it can just be that one message from someone who listened to the podcast, who says, what you said really related with me and it's impacted me in some way, shape, or form. For me, that's enough. Just having that one person, even if it's 6 months later, is enough to remind me, got to keep on putting the stuff out, and hopefully it's going to help and resonate with people somewhere. And the tough thing is that a lot of it is delayed gratification. When it comes to vulnerability, a lot of the times you are vulnerable, and in the moment you feel like there's no reward for your vulnerability. You don't get the reception that you'd liked. You didn't get, if it's on Instagram, you didn't get the likes and the comments that you wanted. And a lot of that becomes something that stops you being more vulnerable in the future. But, I think a big part of vulnerability, and this is for everyone listening and for everyone who's around people who are vulnerable, is recognizing when someone is being vulnerable. It's a two-part game to play here. And, certainly for myself, when I do hear someone else being vulnerable and sharing that with me, is to put myself in their shoes and often recognize how hard of a thing that probably was for them to share. And then to recognize the vulnerability and thank them for the vulnerability and how it's made me feel, because it just, that little thanking, that recognition of vulnerability might be all that person needs to continue to be more vulnerable in the future and create even more amazing connections with the people around them, or, start to work out, by voicing their struggles, to start to work through their struggles and find wins and ways to navigate their obstacles. So yeah, I love vulnerability. Just thought I'd throw some other things in there. I just saw you write something down. What are you thinking?
Yeah, just your point of delayed gratification I really liked, because it is so it depends on who you're speaking to. So if you and I are having a conversation, it probably won't be delayed gratification in terms of vulnerability, because we're both very good at getting into the weeds very quickly about something that we're dealing with, and being able to go from a very casual small talk chat into something very deep and very vulnerable. But there are people that you can share vulnerability with, and they get caught off guard. They don't know how to respond to it. It's similar to kind of like affection or praise. Some people don't really know how to respond to it, and that can also be delayed gratification. But it's important, like you said, important to recognize if someone is being vulnerable to you, but also if you're being vulnerable to someone else, to understand that they might not necessarily have been in the position to receive that vulnerability and to share something with you themselves, but it doesn't mean that it's fallen on deaf ears. And I think very deeply about conversations that I've had with weeks and days before. Something will pop into my head and be like, oh, maybe I should have said this, or maybe they meant this. And actually, the more that I go through life, people do really think deeply about these things and the conversations that they've had and the people that are around them. And just because they haven't shared something with you back, or they didn't necessarily acknowledge it, doesn't mean that it hasn't hit home and they haven't been thinking about it every day or a couple of times since that conversation. Like an example was a client I had. I shared something relatively vulnerable with him in the hope that, could see that he was struggling with something, shared something vulnerable with him in the hope that he would feel safe and comfortable, be able to do something with me, like give some vulnerability to him. And maybe he thinks, oh, it's acceptable to do it, and didn't get anything off him initially. And then a couple of weeks later, then started really opening up about some things and said that he was thankful for, my vulnerability. So it shows that just because something in the short term hasn't worked in terms of that vulnerability, doesn't mean that it hasn't resonated with them and they're not processing it. They just might take a little bit of time for them to open up. And like you said, that could be a couple of days, could be a couple of weeks, could be 6 months or a year from someone being able to come back to, like things like I think about some of the friendships that I could have had with people, or relationships I could have had with people, if I had have been more vulnerable at the time. But you can then look back on those mistakes that you might have made in terms of not being as authentic or as vulnerable as you could have been, and in turn allows you to learn from those mistakes and to continue to be as vulnerable as you can with all the relationships you have.
Nice. Very good additions to the vulnerability point. Okay, nice. Let's move on to the next one. We've got a couple more to go here. Okay, my next one is, and I think this comes back to active listening. I think it's actually funny. I think all of our takeaways from 100 episodes of podcasting are also intertwined. But the next one is, be prepared, but don't be overly prepared. I wish there was a sexier phrase that I could have used there. But I think what that is we have both seen value in having a basic outline of what we want to cover. Rarely, or I'd say, do we ever just come into an episode completely blind with no intention of what we want to talk about. But, there is a fine line between striking a balance of being prepared on what you want to talk about, but then going to the point where you're almost scripting what you want to talk about. And the point when you're actually scripting what you want to talk about, that is essentially a mechanism to shut off active listening, which then obviously prevents the flow of conversation and good chats and, wisdom and experience and all that stuff. So, it's something, when I first started writing the podcast, I would write pages and pages and pages of notes in terms of like how I would like to attack the podcast, and make sure that, you know, when the conversation was happening, if it's just by myself or with someone else, that I was constantly glancing down at my piece of paper to be like, okay, what's next? But now, you know, the podcast typically start with just a rough idea on what we want to talk about, and then we hit record and we just talk. And then we couple all the things we talked about already: authenticity, vulnerability, being present, active listening. And that's, I think, where the magic of conversation and relationship building is.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
I think you have to have that baptism of fire sometimes, where you have to go into one of those situations with a basic structure, but having not scripted it out, and to see the difference. If you know what you're talking about, or you know where you want the conversation to go, to how much better the conversation flows versus when you script it. I think back to like things like uni, like having to do presentations in front of people, and having written down everything that I wanted to say, or say on the slides that you had behind you, you're reading off of the slides, and it just becomes so stagnant in what you're presenting. Whereas if you have a bullet point for something that you want to say, and then you just flow off of it, it makes it so much better. And that is the same for when I've been recording content for social media, or we've been doing videos for YouTube or things like that. And in the past, I would write down every word that I wanted to say, and I'd be like, yeah, that's good if I say it, but I will be reading it off of paper, and it'll be so disjointed, and I'll mumble my words, when actually, if you like, these are the topics that I want to touch on, or these are the things that I want to say, and then just let it flow off the top of the head. As long as you have a good enough understanding of that topic or what you want to say, like, it will flow so much better than it being scripted. Yeah, I think back to like the first couple of episodes that I did where you were like, you host, and I was like, huh? Like writing down like notes on the laptop, and like trying to say, you know, like for example, the first nutrition podcast that we did, that Tammy and I did, and I remember that being very disjointed, you know, just being honest with the listeners. Like I remember listening back to that and being like, I could have been much more free flowing. And again, it was because I was trying to give off information point after point after point, like when you first started, and it's not authentically the advice that I give. And now I think back to it, it's like, what advice would I give to someone if I was sat down with a client on a box and we're in between sets and we're talking about protein? That's how the conversation should flow on the podcast, in my opinion, and in your opinion as well. Like what has worked best for us is that's how it's flowed the best. So I then think that's how the conversation needs to be approached, or that's how the content should be perceived the same, and people find it so much more personable when you approach it in that way. So
I think as well, it's just taking the pressure off yourself to have to be perfect.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I put the pressure on myself when I first started recording the podcast. And it's also something I put the pressure on myself when it came to things like social media and creating content for the process programming, or for Instagram, or for our YouTube page, was trying to make it too perfect. And actually now, you know, remove that pressure. I actually kind of like having a little fumble of my words here and there, or, you know, stumbling over. Yeah, exactly. And I think it does show the human side. I think that's important. Because, you know, I'll tell you, I fell into the trap of trying to make it perfect, probably because a lot of the podcasts I'd listened to, and I actually know this for a fact, you know, had an editor who would, you know, take out all the silent moments, make it flow beautifully, redo certain aspects if they didn't flow, you know, according to, you know, the producer's, you know, standard. Social media, where people might have actually scripted it, or they have a content manager who's helping create it all, or has a screen in the background. And because of that led me into thinking that's what I needed to do. And so, yes, now definitely taking the pressure off myself to try and make it perfect and just be, again, as authentic as possible.
Yeah.
Hold tight, Patrick. I'm going to go turn the light on in this room, because it's now turned into a spotlight, which is actually kind of blinding my right eye. 2 seconds.
You look like a painting.
Yeah. Oh, that's the knees.
If this doesn't get cut out, listeners, that is what Ed Haynes does every time he gets up off the chair.
It's very true. It's better at night. The morning's worst.
Yeah.
Okay. Where are we at?
I don't have any. I just wanted to touch on a highlight for me. Oh, there's the autofocus.
I've got one more.
You go ahead.
I've got my one last one. Prioritizing and scheduling. I think this was a big one for us. Certainly when it was just myself doing the podcast, it was something that I would just squeeze in anywhere I could. So I'd essentially look at my day, and if I had a gap in my schedule, I'd be like, going to record a podcast there. Even when we started working together, we have a shout out to Eric, who works in the Philippines, who basically takes all our content when we create it, downloads it off a Google Drive, and he goes through it and adds in the intro, adds in the sponsors, and adds in the clothing, and basically puts everything on the internet. And poor Eric was having to chase us every single week, being like, guys, where's the episode? And truth be told, we hadn't scheduled and made it a priority in our schedule. So we'd let things like our clients or meetings or just general things in life be put in front of the podcast. But we both knew that it was something we really wanted to do, and it was something we were really passionate about. And I love the saying, I think I got this from Essentialism. It's on my thought bubble board, which is, don't prioritize your schedule your priorities. And I think we both sat down one day and said, the podcast is really important to us. We both love doing it. It's one of the highlights of our week. Let's nail down a time that we never switch up. And this is going to be a time in our day, in our week, where we always record our podcast. And that is this time. Even when you're in the UK, we're still sticking to our time. And so, that's just a good reminder for me on the things that are important. And obviously you need to know what your priorities are. But when you know what they are, I'm a massive advocate of putting those things into my calendar. It's put into my schedule for the rest of my team, rest of my company to see, super black and white, and nothing gets in the way of that.
Yeah, I think, it's just important to have a routine. And if you can, if you know that Wednesday afternoon, that's the time that you do your podcast, then, it just almost becomes automatic, subconscious, with the same as with every routine. But if it's more haphazard about the times that we're doing or when we're going to do it, it just, it doesn't have as much flow. We're not as prepared. Whereas, it gets to Tuesday or Monday and we're like, cool, we'll have a conversation in the gym. And we're like, right, what we're going to do a podcast on this week. Whereas if we don't know what day we're doing it, it's like, oh, well, we'll leave it to Saturday, gets Saturday, we've forgotten. And then it's Sunday or, whatever. So yeah, completely agree.
Okay. What's your highlight then, Paddy? What is it? Is this going to be a highlight of,
I'm just going to say highlight. I'm going to say, I've changed my mind. I was going to say episode. I'm now going to say moment. And my moment that I enjoyed the most was, and going off that vulnerability piece, was when you felt emotional after, when we were talking about spirituality in the episode.
Yeah.
And I just think that that shows the kind of the flow state that we got into when, if you weren't present in that moment and I wasn't present in that moment and we weren't able to have that conversation in that way, there's no way that you would have felt that emotion in sat in a physio room. So, it's a really cool moment for me that we were able to get onto that level, and we're just sat in a physio room having spent 6 hours previous coaching or whatever. I just think
it's so you just bring in that moment up, and I've thought about that moment a lot actually. And what triggered the emotion in me to feel like I was ready to bawl my eyes out in the moment. And you just bringing up that moment, it triggered that same response again, thinking back to it. And if for those who haven't listened to the episode, it was our review on 2021, and you'd asked me a bunch of questions, where the most amount, I had the most amount of growth, and that one was work, one was training, and one was kind of emotional and spiritual. And it was just this concept of spirituality in the universe and thinking about things on a greater level. And I don't know if it's just in talking about it, it just got me really emotional. And I actually reflected on it quite a few times to be like, why did I have those feelings? And I think a lot of it has to do with I guess almost just in a being proud of myself and how far I've come, that's now the level I'm thinking about life and people and things. It's kind of crazy because I would have thought even just a few years ago, even just a couple of years ago, that I'd never be that person that would even probably talk about the words and the concept of spirituality. Anyway, I clearly still have some digging that I need to do to understand why it is triggering quite an emotional reaction in me. But yeah, I'm just going to say just real quick, like that was a massive highlight for me. That was like, yeah, that was a very special moment.
I think that I think that we talked about a level of kind of like proudness is something similar to what I felt. I only did my 2021 proper reflection, so I sat down myself 2 days ago, and I felt kind of like a similar thing. I wouldn't say like emotional in a sense, but not like I felt like I was going to cry, but I felt like I was very happy that I was able to pull those things out of me, almost like have epiphanies in a way, come to conclusions that I would have never thought about before, even a year ago. And it just kind of, again, solidifies that doing these things where you reflect and you are open and honest and vulnerable with yourself, it creates so much more opportunity for growth. And just from some of the points that I've pulled out for myself from my reflections of last year, already I know that the year of growth for 2022 is going to be even better. So
nice. Yeah. Good closing.
What about you? What's the highlight for you?
Well, I hadn't really thought of a highlight, but the first, I think that my biggest highlight, actually, I do have a highlight, has been actually having you be a part of this team. I think where I was at the time before, you joined Coastal and you expressed to me one day that this was something you wanted to do. I think I was probably at the point where I was feeling a little overwhelmed with the podcast. I found it quite lonely. I had lots of things on my plate already, and probably started to second guess my commitment to it and whether I could sustain it. And that's always a scary moment when, you come to that realization where you poured so much energy into something and you created something, and then you start to question whether you want to still do it anymore. And I was probably just starting that reflection process and questioning if it was something I did want to do. And then, you coming forward and saying you want to be a part of it really had a massive impact on being a part of this podcast. Having someone else to bounce ideas from, having someone else who's able to take the lead on episodes, someone who's just, I think we're very like-minded anyway, and I always love our conversations. So being able to put that, and hit record and share that with the universe, I think is just something really special. And of course, like it's allowed me to get to know you much better as a person and grow closer to you as obviously a colleague, fellow coach, but also as a friend, has been, I would say, a really massive highlight of the podcast in 2021 or in the last 100 episodes.
Yeah. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks,
I appreciate that.
Thanks for listening, and thanks for being here, buddy. Here's to another 100 episodes, eh?
And many more.
And many more. All right, folks. Well, thank you very much for listening. Hope you've taken lots out of this, and on to the next 100. Thank you, Patrick.
Bye, Ed.